We're trying to get at the root cause. Why are men in such crisis? I mean, the stats are like only 40% go to college, so they're losing out to women there in a big way. And women with degrees don't marry men who don't have degrees. So. Like, great, you'll be lonely forever, aren't you? Why are you cheering that? That's not.
I mean, they didn't tell my wife.
They don't marry as much, which I think is great, but other people think that's a terrible thing. Okay, people do like a mate, whatever. That's whatever your boat floats by. But there is something going on. I mean, mass shootings is a uniquely male crime. It's always because some dude in Buffalo, you know, had somebody swipe left on him too much. I mean, I feel like that's what's going on here, is a lot of sort of maleness coming to the fore and announcing itself in violence and racism and hatred because they're lonely and lost and feel that they are not useful in society. How did we get there?
The most unstable nations in the world have one thing in common, and that is they have too many lonely, broke, and alone men. It's the most dangerous person in the world. Salman Rushdie wasn't attacked because of the fatwa. He was attacked because a guy was living in his mother's basement. We have a crisis among young men, and it starts at a young age. Young men are twice as likely on a behavior-adjusted basis to be suspended. 7 in 10 high school valedictorians are women. For every two female graduates from college in the next 5 years, you only have one. The scariest stat, walking down the avenue that is America, only 1 in 3 men under the age of 30 have had sex in the last year. And you hear sex and your brain fires. But the bottom line is, it's a key step to the elemental foundation of any society, and that is relationships. Young men aren't attaching to work. They aren't attaching to women. They aren't attaching to schools. We are producing too many of the most dangerous person in society. And we are losing out on a key. We're not going to have kids. We're not going to have a productive society. We're going to have more violence. And also, we're going to have a society that does not value young men. And they do not. Young men are different. They develop later. And by the way, if you're a young man, this work from home thing is a disaster. They need young men need guardrails. They need to know how to read a room. They need to put on a clean shirt. They know not to get high or drink too much during the week and then get into the office the next day. We have a crisis among young men. It is one of the most, in my view, one of the most dangerous things in our society.
And where do you put the phone in this equation? Because I put it high up. Because, thank you. Because I was reading recently, Tinder, 2-to-1 male to female.
Oh.
What?
No, it's just a startling statistic, yeah.
Right. Well, why is it startling? I mean, it sounds like a great idea. Oh, I can just order women like I do a pizza on my phone. I think I'll have the Kelly today. Except when you go on it, it weeds out the people who aren't the best looking, I think, because, it used to be go to a bar, okay, maybe it was potluck, but you have to be able to learn to 100%. Talk to a woman. I don't think they had to talk to a woman anymore, because it's just on the phone. It's just like, what's up? And then, what's up, and send a picture of your penis. Like, that's gonna work.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
You asked about the phone. Simply put, it's a disaster. Whenever technology comes into an industry, it consolidates it. Mating has been consolidated in the worst way. 50 men on Tinder, 50 women. 46 of the women show all of their attention to just 4 men, leaving 46 men pursuing just 4 women. If mating was a country, it would be more unequal than Venezuela. We have huge mating inequality. And here's the problem. When people don't get together and there's no pheromones and there's no vibe, women, and we don't like to say this on the left, primarily try and make very quick assumptions about this individual's ability to garner resources in the future. So what you have is this concentration of interest, and you're ending up with Porsche polygamy, where 10% of the men get 90% of the attention, which does not lead to good behavior or form long-term relationships. E-commerce was disastrous for retail. Social media was disastrous for everybody. Online dating is disastrous for mating and for men. It's terrible.
Martin Luther King's dream was that there would come a time when people would not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. How is today's identity politics consistent with that vision?
Jordan Peterson.
Well, I don't think it's consistent with that vision at all. I mean, the problem I have with identity politics as a mode of philosophical apprehension is that it's predicated on the idea that the appropriate way to classify people is by their group identity, in whatever fragmentary formulation that might take, in the multiplicity of ways that people can be divided into groups. And the classical postmodern, and I would also say Marxist way of viewing the world, even though those two things shouldn't be allowed together, they tend to be, is that group identity takes priority over individual identity, and I think that's precisely the opposite of what Martin Luther King was hoping for and working for. And I think it's unbelievably dangerous, partly because when you assume that people should primarily be identified by their group, then you can also attribute group guilt to them by their group. And then things go downhill very, very rapidly. And we've had no shortage of evidence of that sort of thing happening, say, throughout the 20th century.
Are there particular groups that you are more concerned about than others? For example, the Liberal Party, as Terry Butler said earlier, is a group. Are there groups that you think are more dangerous?
There isn't a problem with groups. The problem is with assuming that the fundamental way that you should categorize people is with their group identity. Obviously, we all belong to groups. The issue is whether or not the individual identity is primary and the group identity is secondary, or the group identity is primary and the individual identity is secondary. If you're a proponent, for example, of equality of outcome, of quotas, then you de facto accept the proposition that it's the group identity that is primary, and there's all sorts of dangers that are associated with that far outweigh whatever good you're likely to do.
Okay,
Or maybe you just...
Go ahead.
Or maybe you just think that representative democracy should be representative. Maybe you just think that women should be equally represented in the decision-making fora of our nation. Maybe that's really just about having proper equality in a body that's meant to be representative.
Well, I do believe that women should have... I don't understand your question, I guess.
I guess you don't. That's pretty obvious, unfortunately.
Well, how about if you phrase it more clearly, instead of just insulting me? Look at it this way. Let's talk about quotas for a minute. So there's a very wide array of jobs that are fundamentally done by men. So, for example,
Member of Parliament.
99.9% of
Sorry, Alex, I'm going to
bricklayers.
stop sledging you now, I promise.
I'm happy to give my minute to Jordan.
99.9% of bricklayers are men. Should we have quotas for women?
Is bricklaying representative democracy?
That has nothing to do with the question. The question is if there's evidence of structural inequality and oppression because women aren't precisely represented at 50% in all professions at all levels, then why don't we have a conversation about having women represented in all professions at all levels? Why do we talk about the C-suite, for example? Why do we talk about politics and positions of power? Why don't we talk about it across the board?
Okay, so let's just pause and...
yeah, but that's because it's power.
You pose a question to Terry Butler. Go ahead and answer it, then we'll hear from the other panellists.
His question to me?
Well, yeah, if you'd,
about
like,
bricklayers.
if you'd like to answer the question about bricklayers.
There's nothing wrong with bricklayers.
Why there are no
Of course
quotas in
there's not.
Speaking of which, I got sent this thread by Rob Henderson earlier on, which is really interesting. Could the matching imbalance on Tinder and other dating apps be a factor in the rise of the incel movement and young men reporting low sexual activity? So there's a graph here that says the young men, share of men and women between the ages of 18 and 30 reporting no sex in the past year. And that has gone up from 10% to 30% for men since around about 2010 to 2020 to now, right? So over the last decade, the number of men reporting no sex in the last year has tripled. And the line on the graph has got where Tinder's introduced, and it is exactly when men where that inflection for men beginning to go from the 10% to the 20 to 28%. Women also actually stay flat for a little while, but have increased, which is also very interesting. Wealth in Tinder is not distributed equally. Attractive guys have more wealth in the Tinder economy. They get more likes than unattractive guys. That's the bottom 80% of men, bottom 20% of women, top 80% of women, top 20% of men thing, which a lot of people are familiar with. There's a thing called a Gini coefficient, which works out how much inefficiency there is within a system. So it's used to look at economies within countries, and the lower that the number is, the more equality there is within wealth distribution. So if modern dating apps were a country, it would be one of the most unequal in the world. The Tinder economy has a higher Gini coefficient than 95.1% of the countries in the world. It's just below South Africa. It's above Venezuela.
In disparity of wealth.
It's above Venezuela and just below South Africa. That's where it sits. According to open source data, a man of average attractiveness can only be expected to be liked by slightly less than 1% of females, 0.87% on Tinder. This equates to 1 like for every 115 females, and men in the bottom 10% see just 1 match per week at most. Ultimately, most women only swipe on a handful of men per day, while men are more freewheeling with their swipes. So, yeah, females pass on 95% and like on 5, and men are basically 50-50 left and right. It's just...
we had talked about Tinder before, and one thing that I think is actually really interesting was before Tinder, there were websites like eHarmony. You remember that?
Match.com.
Match.com.
Plenty of fish.
And the way that we looked at it, you know, the guys in my friend group, the people my age, we looked at it as like, oh, what a weird fucking idea. Online dating, super weird. You're a weird, like it was just kind of like, what the hell? And then here's Tinder, this fun little swipey thing. It's kind of about hookups. It's a meme, right? It's like a meta commentary. It's just like, this is hilarious. We're swiping. It's hilarious. We match. Oh, what's up? And then almost immediately after that, online dating becomes something serious. It becomes something like, well, I haven't gotten any dates. Let me go online. There's really not much resisting to whether it's cool or not. You can resist whether you want to do it, or whether it's legit or not, or if the masses are doing it. But if someone says, hey, I'm on Hinge or I'm on Tinder, they're not going to get made fun of because it's just the masses are doing that. Whereas eHarmony and Match.com, like if you had done that at the time where they were very prevalent for, I think, older generations, it was definitely seen as a weird thing.
That's the same as anything, though, right? There's adoption curves happen slowly.
But it wasn't like eHarmony. It wasn't like we all jumped on eHarmony. We all jumped on the hookup app.
Oh, there was something about Tinder that made this.
The location services was, I think, the thing. You are in the same location as that person. Here's a picture of them. Do what you want with it. Rather than this kind of weird, almost like MySpace-y type of AOL vibe to it, which you would get from eHarmony and Match.com.
Yeah.
Maybe on the Tinder thing, you get this handheld, location services, this app on your device that
good user experience
separates it,
less boomery. Well, why do you think it would be that the introduction of Tinder would increase the number of men reporting no sex? Do you think it's just women? Do you think that what this guy's implying in the thread is because of this high inequality that women are sort of wistfully chasing after the 8 out of 10s and above for guys, and they're not giving any attention to the dudes at the bottom? Because you would have presumed, maybe, if you hadn't been able to work out what was actually going to go on, everyone's talking to everyone more. That should facilitate more casual sex for everybody overall. But what it seems has happened is the gains have been sort of accrued to the very few super chads at the top. And then there's this big sexless underclass of men that is now 30% of men reporting no sex within the last year.
Yeah, I mean, more matches for the female would mean, why would you take the male that you're less attracted to, right? Like, why would you take the opportunity if you know you can match with more and more and more and more people? you're going to leave out a very large chunk of other people where men apparently do not have that option. So yeah, I mean, they're just chasing after the potential match that they know is more likely going to happen. Maybe if those two people meet, like, this is also another thing. Women are, and men are now looking at their potential mate through the lens of looks. Whereas before, you might not think someone is attractive until there's some sort of action that makes them attractive. Whether that's someone in your class or someone you go to the gym with or whatever, that interaction is what makes them attractive. And then you're looking at someone who, if you saw their Tinder profile or if you saw their Hinge profile, you would not have swiped. So maybe that's occurring less, potential mates. Like, you just had on a guest who said that the worst quality to look for a long-term relationship is looks.
Conventional attractiveness, yeah.
And that is exactly what people are looking at when they get these apps.
Well, I think that this probably explains a big chunk of why relationships are now increasingly short. And this is something that people don't necessarily see. So it's easy to say there is now a global sexual marketplace. Anybody with an Instagram account or a Tinder account can basically be in the entire world's sexual marketplace, right? They can be dating somebody in Guatemala or Bali or Germany or wherever they want. And therefore, that means that people are mate switching more easily because the friction of doing that is lower, and because the number of competitors for whoever your mate is significantly higher now, and that women will lily pad from one guy to one guy, from one Chad to one Chad to the next one. Now, the thing that Seth Stevens-Davidowitz said that was really interesting is that the algorithms can predict what you're going to click on unbelievably well. They will be able to predict with like insane accuracy whether you'll swipe left or right on someone, and the algorithms can do basically nothing to work out whether or not you'll have long-term happiness and whether a relationship will last long-term. So, for the people that didn't see the episode, the things that are most often used as cues for whether or not someone will swipe right or left are things like height, conventional attractiveness, wealth level, and job. Right? Those are some of the most common things that are used. These have basically zero correlation with whether or not a relationship is happy long-term. Those things were psychological stability, conscientiousness, a growth mindset, a bunch of other things, none of which can be displayed on a Tinder profile. I can't tell whether you've got a growth mindset or whether you're somebody that's psychologically
mentally stable.
Yep, precisely. Yeah. In fact, you might be able to try and signal precisely that through your looks and then have the complete opposite. You can put window dressing up as much as you want. So my point being that what people are doing now is optimizing for the wrong parameters. People are optimizing for things which are completely arbitrary when it comes to long-term relationship happiness. For girls, things like height. I think it's something like 80% of women on Hinge have their height limit set to 6 foot or above for men. That's less than 10%, I want to say, less than 10 or 15% of men in the United States are above 6 foot, and yet height has zero predictive ability when it comes to looking at long-term relationship happiness. Imagine you saying to me, dude, I only date girls who are a size 4.5 shoe. I'd be like, why? I know that this has no bearing on whether or not you're going to be happy in this relationship, but you just pick this arbitrary thing because it's become captured by the culture that girls that are size 4.5 feet.
Do you know what? I almost have a reasoning for that. This is anecdotal, but I feel as though girls hold more of an animus towards these dating apps. So they say, look, if I'm going to get on Hinge, I'm going to get the best of the best. And if it doesn't work, no problems for me. I don't give a shit. I don't give a shit if I get one match, if I get 10 matches. I don't care. I'm on this thing to not get fucked over, but if I'm going to get someone, they better be tall. They better be good looking. They better be this, this, and this. Where maybe it's not the same approach for men, right? I can honestly say that I've heard many, many women just say, like, it's almost like the dating app owes them for being on.
Because they resent the fact that they maybe have to be on there.
They resent the idea that they're there, yes.
What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for the full, unedited episode. and don't forget to subscribe. Peace.
Let me check with you first. Raise your hand, please, if you have a son, a grandson, or a nephew. Please raise your hand. All right. Oh, no, keep your hand raised, please. If your son, grandson, or nephew is having problems either with motivation, grades, ADHD, or addiction to video games. Keep your hands raised if they fit, one of your sons, grandsons, or nephews fits that category. Okay, about 30% of the audience fits that category. So question one is, why are we blind to something that is so much around us that we would have to even ask the question, is there a boy crisis? Second two, is there a boy crisis? Number three that I'll be looking at tonight is some causes and a solution or two. So let me start with our blindness. Think about when we hear of a police officer shooting a black boy. We rightly protest, Black Lives Matter. But no one even thinks of saying, boys' lives matter. The boy in Black Boy we're invisible to. Black boys, the boy part of Black Boy doesn't matter because historically, we've been dependent upon boys dying in order for us to live. We bribe them by social bribes calling them heroes, telling them they'll have glory if they die on our behalf. So our first issue is, if our very survival has been dependent upon our sons' willingness to die, being sensitive to their death competes with our survival instinct. We can't get anywhere in terms of seeing the evidence for the boy crisis unless we take that curtain up first. When we take that curtain up, I think the type of evidence we'll be seeing is that for the first time in US history, our sons will have less education than their dads. If we take this worldwide, the UN found this year that boys have fallen behind girls in every single one of the 70 developed nations. So what do developed nations have in common? They have in common a much greater propensity for divorce, leaving boys oftentimes without their dads. So dad-deprived boys becomes the #1 cause of the boy crisis. When you have less father involvement, what happens is that the boy ends up, and a girl, by the way, ends up having less likelihood of being empathetic, assertive, being much more likely to do badly in every single grade area in school, being more likely to be suicidal, homicidal, to shoot up schools, and being more likely to be in prison. When you look at prisons, prisons are basically centers for dad-deprived boys. In California, since 1980, we've built 18 new prisons, 1 new university. There's been a 700% increase in the prison population in the United States since 1972. That's a 93% male population, mostly a dad-deprived boy population. Here's the most frequent pattern. The boy hears his parents in conflict, soon the dad disappears. The boy becomes depressed. Anthony Sims here in Oakland, his last Facebook post was, "I wish I had a father." Boys who hurt us. Anthony Sims soon became the Oakland killer earlier this year. But other boys act out not by killing singly like Anthony Sims, but act out by doing school shootings. Most people don't know that there has been 1 school shooting per week on average since Sandy Hook. And we often say school shootings, they're the result of guns, they're the result of family values, they're the result of mental health problems. But girls live in the same families with the same family values, the same similar mental health problems, the same violence on TV, and our daughters are not doing the shootings. Our sons are. And so here's just a sense of the location of those shootings in 2 years after Sandy Hook. School shootings are mostly white boys' method of acting out their hopelessness, and also the white boys' method of committing suicide. My perspective is I see suicide as a reflection in boys of our inability to help track boys in a constructive way toward manhood. And we see that in the data also. So for example, before age 9, girls and boys committed suicide equally. Age 10 to 14, twice the amount for boys. 15 to 19, 4 times the amount. Age 20 to 24, 6 times the amount for boys. So if dad-deprived boys is the number 1 cause of the boy crisis, the number 2 cause is very much related. Boys go from the dad deprivation in home to a male teacher deprivation in school. We didn't used to know the importance of that. We now know that boys do better with male teachers on average. But we also have discovered this year, as a result of the UN doing a study worldwide, that the feminization of education is a contributing factor to boys' problems. When the United Nations did a study worldwide, they found that boys all over the world are 1/3 more likely to be graded higher on a reading test when the teacher does not know that the person who took the test is a boy. This leads to cause 3, lack of purpose. When I was a boy, we basically had 2 senses of purpose. You were either a warrior or you were a sole breadwinner. But as divorces occurred, male-female relationships got shook up, and boys, and the feminist movement came in, and they did a wonderful thing, which was they expanded girls' sense of purpose from the old raise children only to being able to raise children, raise money, or do some combination of both. But no one stepped in and helped expand boys' sense of purpose in an equivalent way. Instead, boys were told, earn money, earn money, earn money, or alternatively, be a loser. The women's movement and the society helped create affirmative action to introduce women to professions they hadn't been comfortable with, such as the STEM professions, so science, technology, engineering, and math. But no one introduced boys to the caring professions. So one possible solution to the purpose void is to expand boys' sense of purpose, to consider the option of being a full-time dad, an elementary school teacher, a social worker, a nurse. We even have to say words like male nurse. Or we can look at, more broadly, the creation of a larger White House Council on Boys and Men in the way that we already have a White House Council on Women and Girls to address the 10+ causes of the boy crisis. A question that somebody once asked me was, well, will boys not consider themselves losers when they become full-time involved in the caring professions? And there is pressure in that. But I saw back as early as 1976 a clear example of why boys will not consider themselves losers when they get more involved with their sons. I was at a party in 76, and a guy comes up to me and says, "Are you Warren Farrell?" And I go, "Yes." And he goes, "You formed a men's group that I joined, and the group had more impact on my life than any other thing." And I said, "Well, what created that?" And he goes, "The most important question the group asked me was an exercise in which we were asked, what is the biggest hole in your heart?" And I didn't know the answer, but I blurted out without thinking about it, that it's actually, I was so involved in my career, I told the group, Warren, that I ended up neglecting my son, neglecting my wife, and that's the biggest hole in my heart. And it's really a deeper hole now because I got divorced, I got remarried, and the men's group knew at the time that my wife was pregnant and with a boy. And the group said to me, well, what would you like to do if you could do anything you wanted? And I said, well, actually, it would be to take 5 years off and raise my son full time. And the group encouraged me, I should say pressured me, to ask my wife and talk to her about that. And my wife said, go for it, John. And so I went for it. And it's now been 2 years. And I said to him, good decision? No, the best decision of my life. Up until I took care of my son, all of my life was about me, 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 me. Suddenly it was about my son, my son. Every move I made, I considered precious. Every day I wanted to wake up and support him. I suddenly learned to love and be love. As he said that, somebody came up to the table that we were sitting at. I had just come back from my first book tour, been on TV a great deal, and this guy says to me, can I have your autograph? And I go, sure, generous me. And the other guy, and the fellow asking for the autograph says, well, actually, I meant the other guy. I'm dying of embarrassment, and self-righteousness caught up with me. And I said, I guess you're famous. So what's your last name, John? I haven't had a TV for about 8 years. And John goes, Lennon. And I go, let's see, proud of myself, mind you. You're a member of a singing group, aren't you? And he goes, yeah. And I go, what's the name of that group? He goes, the Beatles. And I go, oh, now that ignorant I was not. What I got from that experience with John was that John Lennon had basically told me that he had discovered another John Lennon. A John Lennon who was not dependent on getting love by earning money as a human doing, but a John Lennon who could get love by being love. I think he pointed a way to us for an evolutionary shift of us being able to get love by being love. I think no one suggested that we imagine that better than John when he said, all you need is love. Thank you.
A number of people warned me against writing a book about boys and men because it's such a fraught subject, particularly in politics right now, and because so many people were afraid that merely drawing attention to the problems of boys and men was implying somehow less effort being paid to girls and women, that it's framed as zero sum, and it's sort of a whose side are you on question, and you have to be on one side or the other rather than just being on the side of human flourishing. One of the real challenges here is that if there are men missing from certain crucial areas of our society and our economy, that makes it harder for other men and boys to flourish in those areas. We have an education system that has a dearth of male teachers. We have a labour market where the jobs that are growing fastest are ones where we have the fewest men. And in families, there's the growth in what you might call the dad deficit or fatherlessness. As men are struggling in each of those areas, what you'll see is it'll be harder for other men to follow in their footsteps. It's harder for boys to flourish if their fathers aren't engaged. It's harder for men to enter occupations where there aren't men. It's harder for boys to do well at school where there are no male teachers to be seen. And so there's a very real danger that unless we act quite soon, that we will set in train something of a vicious cycle. I'm Richard Reeves. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And my latest book is Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why That Matters, and What to Do About it. The overall picture is that on almost every measure, at almost every age, and in almost every advanced economy in the world, the girls are leaving the boys way behind, and the women leaving the men.
What nobody expected was that girls and women wouldn't just catch up to boys and men in education, but would blow right past them and keep going. Everyone was very focused, quite rightly, on getting to gender equality, getting to gender parity. It's not that long ago where there was a huge gender gap the other way, and there was huge focus, correctly, in the 70s and 80s to really promote women and girls in education. But the line just kept going, and nobody predicted that. Nobody was saying, what if gender inequality re-emerges in just as big a way as now, in some cases bigger, but the other way around? And to some extent, everyone's still trying to get their head around this new world where, at least in education, when you talk about gender inequality, you're pretty much always talking about the ways in which girls and women are ahead of boys and men. And that's happened in a very, very short period of human history. So if you look at the US, for example, in the average school district in the US, girls are almost a grade level ahead of boys in English and have caught up in math. If we look at those with the highest GPA scores, the top 10%, 2/3 of those are girls. If we look at those at the bottom, 2/3 of those are boys. When it comes to going to college, there's a 10% gap in college enrollment, a similar sized gap in completing college, conditional on enrolling. And the result of those trends is that the gender gap in getting a college degree is now wider than it was in 1972, but the other way around. So in 1972, when Title IX was passed to promote more gender equality in education, there was a 13 percentage point gap in favor of men getting college degrees. Now there's a 15 percentage point gap in favor of women getting college degrees. So the gender inequality we see in college today is wider than it was 50 years ago. It's just the other way around. There's quite a fierce debate about the differences between male and female brains. And in adulthood, I think there's not much evidence that the brains are that different in ways that we should worry about or that are particularly consequential. But where there's no real debate is in the timing of brain development. It is quite clear that girls' brains develop more quickly than boys' brains do, and that the biggest difference seems to occur in adolescence. So what happens is in adolescence, we develop what neuroscientists call the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex of our brain is sometimes known as the CEO of the brain. It's the bit of your brain that says you should do your chemistry homework rather than going out to party. It's the bit of your brain that says it is worth maintaining a high GPA because it will help you get to college, which might help you in the future. And that bit of the brain develops considerably earlier in girls than in boys, between 1 and 2 years earlier, partly because girls go into puberty a bit earlier than boys, and that seems to trigger some of this development. What that means is that if you have an education system that rewards the ability to turn in homework, stay on task, worry about your GPA, prepare for college and so on, then just structurally, that's going to put at an advantage the group whose brains have developed earlier in those particular areas. And that turns out on average to be girls. I think it's a great irony of women's progress that by taking the brakes off women's educational opportunities and aspirations, we've revealed the fact that the education system is slightly structured against boys and men because of these differences in the timing of brain development. But it took the women's movement to show that, because the natural advantages of women in education were impossible to see when women's aspirations were being capped by a sexist society. Now that those caps have been largely removed, we can see that it's boys and men who are at a disadvantage in the education system. At the risk of sounding boring, let's collect the data first so we know what we're dealing with here. I do think that we should be strongly encouraging boys to start school a year later than girls. I think that should become the default in many school districts because of the developmental gap that there is between boys and girls. Because boys' brains mature more slowly, then them starting school a year later would mean that they were developmentally closer to being peers with the girls in the classroom. We need a lot more male teachers. It's striking that the teaching profession has become steadily more female over time. Only 24% of K-12 teachers now are male. That's down from 33% in the 80s. And fewer men are applying to teacher training year on year. And so we've seen this steady shift towards a close to an all-female environment. That has all kinds of consequences for the ethos of the school, for the way we deal with different kinds of behavior among boys and girls, for example. And so we need a very serious and intentional effort to get more men into teaching. The third thing I would do in this world where I have significant power to dictate policies would be significantly more investment in vocational education and training. That is an area where we do seem to see better results for boys and men on average, and one that's woefully underinvested in the US. The US has really bet most of its dollars on a very academic, a very narrow route towards success, and less emphasis on vocational training. And that has actually put boys and men at a disadvantage. So apprenticeships, technical high schools are actually a really good way to help more boys and men. I think one of the challenges with this debate is that if you're talking to women and men who are, say, at the top of the economic ladder, 4-year college degrees, decent incomes, they look around and they don't see some of these issues. But that's not the same for working class men. That's not the same for men lower down the economic ladder. So there's a danger that we're so busy, to borrow Sheryl Sandberg's phrase, so busy leaning in that we don't look down. The reality for men further down the ladder is very different. The economic trends for men have turned downwards along 4 dimensions. One is wages. Most men today earn less than most men did in 1979. In employment, with a drop in labour force participation of 8 percentage points, which means 9 million men now of prime age are not working. We've seen a drop in occupational stature, and so there are now more men working in employment areas which are seen as lower status than they were in the past. And we've also seen a drop in the acquisition of skills, the kinds of skills and education that boys and men need. If boys don't get educated and men don't get skilled, they will struggle in the labour market. And across all of those domains, we've seen a downwards turn for men in the last 4 or 5 decades. And so the way in which social class divides have opened up, economic inequality has widened, is really important to understand in the context of gender inequality. If we only focus on gender gaps, then we miss the fact that both men and women at the top have done increasingly well, but that's much less true of everybody else, and especially it's less true of those from lower income backgrounds, working class boys and men, and black boys and men. You see many of those trends are amplified, and so those boys and men are really at the sharpest end of many of the social and economic changes. On the one hand, we have a huge and successful and laudable effort to get more women into STEM jobs, so science, technology, engineering, and math. On the other side, we have what I call HEAL jobs. So that's health, education, administration, and literacy, almost, if you like, the opposite side of the coin to STEM jobs. And that's where a lot of the jobs are coming from. Health and education alone are huge and growing sectors in the US. And so by my estimates, for every 1 job we're going to create in STEM between now and 2030, we're going to create 3 in HEAL jobs. But those jobs are at least as gender segregated as STEM jobs, but in the other direction. And unlike STEM, becoming more so over time. So if you look at the HEAL sector, only 24% of the workers in those sectors are male, and that number is falling. And in particular sectors, we're seeing a really precipitous drop in the number of men. We have a drop in the number of male teachers. We have a very sharp drop in the number of male psychologists. That's dropped from 39% male to 29% male in the last decade alone. And among psychologists under the age of 30, only 5% are male. So we roll that forward, and we're going to see psychology becoming essentially almost an all-female profession. So these jobs, which are both crucial, I think, for society, and where it'd be very useful to have more diversity, are actually becoming more gender segregated. And so we have absolutely no effort to get more men into HEAL jobs, which is where I think the future lies and where we should be helping men to move. One of the problems that we face is what I call in the book a dad deficit. And that can be seen in various different ways. So 1 in 4 fathers don't live with their children. If parents split up, they're much more likely to lose contact with their fathers and with their mothers. And so 1 in 3 children, if their parents split up, don't see their father at all after a few years post the separation. So this fatherlessness is something that's very, very specific. And when 4 in 10 children are born outside marriage, and most children to less educated parents are born outside marriage, then we have to reinvent what it means to be a father. Because right now, men are still being held to an old standard of what it meant to be a successful father in a world where that is neither possible for many of them or even desirable, because what we've seen is as women have grown in economic power and economic independence, then of course they're going to choose to be with a man rather than being forced to, as in the old days. This is probably the greatest liberation in human history, honestly, that women can now choose whether to be with a man or not. More than 2 out of 5 households in the US now, a woman is the main breadwinner. 40% of American women earn more than the average man. These are huge economic changes and all for the good, but it does pose some really sharp questions about what fathers are for. And until we escape the obsolete model of the breadwinner father, then we will continue to see more and more men being left out of family life. And the kicker is that boys in families that don't have a father presence suffer much more than girls. And so then what happens is that male disadvantage can become intergenerational, because if the fathers are struggling and therefore not really involved in their kids' lives, then the boys are the ones who suffer most, who will then go on to struggle themselves in education and the labour market. It's clear by now that marriage and social institutions and a sense of purpose matter to men. And so as we've seen these real challenges faced by men in education, work, and family, you're seeing some really difficult and troubling health consequences. And so the so-called deaths of despair from suicide, overdose, or alcohol, 3 times higher among men than among women. Suicide itself, 3 times higher among men and women, and rising very quickly, especially among middle-aged men and younger men. So we can see these as symptoms, I think, of a broader malaise, which is what's troubling boys and men. And for men in particular, this sense of purpose is very important. I think it's a human universal that we need to be needed. There's a wonderful piece of work by an academic called Fiona Shand who looked at the last words that men had used to describe themselves before committing suicide or attempting suicide. And the top of the list were worthless and useless. I think if we create a society in which so many men do feel like they're not needed, then it's no surprise that we see these deaths of despair, we see problems with opioids. Opioids are a much bigger problem for men than they are for women. And one of the great tragedies of opioid deaths is the death rates are higher in part because the users are on their own. And so in some ways, the opioid epidemic is a perfect illustration of a whole series of things we're talking about, which is a loss of role in the family, a loss of status in the labor market, turning to drugs, and being isolated and withdrawn. And so in that example, I think you can see a symptom of this broader male malaise that we just need to take it more seriously. And we have a cultural responsibility as a society, men and women together, to help men and boys to adjust to this new world. Because right now, many of them are really struggling.
Get smarter, faster with videos from the world's biggest thinkers. To learn even more from the world's biggest thinkers, get Big Think Plus for your business.